Okay, this tutorial is covering the topic of calculating inpatient census statistics. And over the next several weeks, you're going to be learning how to calculate a lot of different statistics that are captured and used throughout healthcare. So this is just our very first focus, the inpatient census statistics. This is covered in your textbook on pages 547 to 549 if that helps you to have that reference and to read over that. As I said, we're going to be learning a lot of different statistics, which means different formulas for calculating all of these different calculations. So because there are quite a few of these, I made a little notes spreadsheet for myself that I wanted to share with you. This just helped me to organize the information about the different statistics, and I've shared this with you over in the Module 6 classroom on the discussion board. This is not something you have to use, just something that I thought you might find helpful over the next several modules. And you can just fill in the information with notes as you go. So you would type or write in the name of the statistic, such as census, and then what's the definition of that, what's the formula for calculating it, and then any rules or special information, because you'll see that most of the different calculations have criteria or different rules that you have to know in order to apply the formula correctly. And you may remember that from working with C-section rates in the previous module. So that's just something that you can use if you want to, not something that you would be turning in or that you have to worry about completing. Okay, when we hear the word census, most of us have heard this term. Not necessarily in relation to healthcare, but even just out in the world. And a lot of times we think about the census that's taken, the U.S. Census that's taken periodically. Census kind of brings to mind the word count, and that same definition follows through in healthcare. But in healthcare, we're talking specifically about counting patients, and all different types of healthcare facilities will have an inpatient census. The census can be talking about counting all of the patients in a hospital or a facility, or it can just be focused on a specific area. It might be a census for critical care, or for pediatrics, or for oncology, broken down by floors or units. There's different things that the census is used for. It's used for monitoring, for knowing, okay, how many patients are in our care at this time? Do we have any open beds? Things like that. Planning as far as, okay, how many supplies do we need? Do we need to plan in the future to expand this floor because it's staying full all the time? Are we not having enough patients on this floor and we need to look at planning something differently along those lines? Budgeting, staffing, just all types of different administrative decisions can be based on the census. The census also becomes the basis for some other statistics, some other calculations that we'll talk about here over the next several weeks. In most facilities today, the census is done electronically, but it may be verified manually. Typically, the whole census for the whole hospital wouldn't be manually verified because of the time involved with that, but it may be manually verified by unit or by floor. So the unit clerk or the charge nurse might at each shift print out the census and make sure that it matches up to the actual patients that they have in care on the floor. From this point forward, for this class, or during this module, when I'm talking about the census, we're going to be focusing on the whole hospital. So if you'll just kind of have that in your mind, know that the census can apply to all different types of facilities and to specific floors, but in the upcoming instructions that I'm going to be giving, I'm talking about the whole hospital. So just kind of have that in your mind. Okay, part of what kind of makes the census topic confusing is that there are lots of very similar terms, and you'll see what I mean as we move through the module. But I just want to caution you about that and let you know that the details are very important. You have to know these terms word for word Otherwise, you're going to get them all mixed up. So you've really got to pay attention to details and know that I'm going to be giving you several terms with the word census in them, and there are differences between each of the terms. Okay, first one that we're going to look at, as I said, it can be confusing. Different facilities and different textbooks kind of use these two terms interchangeably, census and inpatient census. But either one of those is referring to the number of inpatients that is present at any given time. Now we're going to break that definition down a little bit. Let's look at the first part. Number of inpatients. Remember that we talked about on the previous tutorial the definition of inpatient, someone who's receiving room, board, and continuous nursing care in an area of the hospital where patients would generally stay the night. So it's the number of inpatients who are present at any given time. The time might vary from facility to facility. Typically, the reporting period goes from 12:01 a.m., so 1 minute after midnight, all the way up to 12 midnight, and then the census is taken at midnight. So what that period is not regulated, but the important thing is that it's consistent, and most facilities do use this time frame. But there's nothing saying what time the census has to be taken, as long as the hospital does it consistently every day at the same time. The other thing to remember about inpatients is that oftentimes adults and children are counted separately from newborns. So that's just something else to keep in mind. So that would be, if you were filling in the chart that I had shown you, your statistic would be census or inpatient census. And the definition would be the number of inpatients present at any given time. The formula we'll talk about in just a few minutes. The rules or special information, you would want to remember that adults and children are counted separately from newborns, and that the time must be consistent. Okay, so how do we calculate it? What's the formula for the census? You're going to take the previous day's ending census count. So if I'm taking the census for today, then I want to see, okay, how many patients did I have at the end of the day yesterday? Then I'll add in the admissions, subtract the discharges, and that should tell me the number of patients in the hospital or in the facility at my census time tonight, if that's midnight. And I'm going to be saying midnight, and just know that that's not, again, set in stone, but since that's the typical time, that's the time that I'm going to refer to. So here's an example. If the inpatient census on June the 1st was 723 at midnight, at the census taking time, and then after that point, on June 2nd, there were 32 admissions. So I'm going to add 723 plus my admissions of 32, and that gives me 755 patients. Now I've got to subtract out my discharges. So there have been 17 discharges. 755 minus 17 gives me 738. So my inpatient census for June the 2nd would be 738. All right. Next term, so this would be your second statistic that you're learning is, and you'll see how these terms do seem to overlap. The second statistic is the daily inpatient census. Now, the really important part of this term is that first word, daily. So when you hear that, think in terms of the whole day. Now, this is just like the census that we just talked about, but there's something else that you have to add in. It also includes patients who were admitted and discharged on the same day. So we would take our ending census from the day before, add in our admissions, subtract out our discharges, and then add in any patients who were admitted and discharged within that same day. In other words, maybe they came in at 8 in the morning and they left at noon. They would be added in to the daily inpatient census, because it's not looking at care just at one specific point during the day. It's looking at the patients that have been in care throughout the whole day. That's why it's the daily inpatient census. Again, the time is determined by the facility, but it has to be consistent. And adults and children are again counted separately from newborns. So to review, this is the daily inpatient census. The definition is that it's the number of inpatients present at the official census taking time plus any patients who have been admitted or discharged during that same day. That definition carries over into your formula that it's inpatients from midnight the day before plus the admissions minus the discharges plus those who have been admitted and discharged. The rules or special information is that the time is determined by the facility, but it must be consistent, and that it includes the admissions and discharges as well as those that were admitted and discharged the same day. And again, adults and children are counted separately from newborns. Okay, next term or next calculation that you need to be familiar with is the inpatient service day. The inpatient service day is a unit of measure. It represents the services that are received by one inpatient during a 24-hour period. It does include all inpatients who received care that day. So just like we were talking about for the daily inpatient census, you count patients who maybe were only in care for a few hours. They came in, were admitted, and then discharged. Same thing when you're looking at inpatient service days. If they were only there for 2 hours, they're still counted. The inpatient service days are equal to the daily inpatient census as long as you're looking at the same time period. So if I was doing the daily inpatient census for June the 1st and then I wanted to know the inpatient service days for June the 1st, those two would be equivalent as long as my census times were the same, as long as they were both, say, from 12:01 a.m. to midnight. The inpatient service day is used to reflect the volume of services. How many patients is the facility providing services to? And it's kind of an indicator of how the facility is doing financially. Inpatient service days can be calculated daily, weekly, monthly, or annually. If you have daily inpatient or inpatient service days for several days, you can add those together to get total inpatient service days. In other words, if I'm looking at a part of my week and for Monday the inpatient service days were 200, Tuesday 205, and Wednesday 210, I can just simply add those together to get my total inpatient service days for those 3 days. It would be 615. Okay, this is the last one that we're going to cover during this tutorial. The average daily census. So this should be the fourth statistic if you're making a list or using the table. The average daily census is the average number of inpatients who are treated during a given period of time. So the average number of inpatients treated during a specific day or for a specific week, month, whatever the case may be. Again, adults and children are separate from newborns. The formula for calculating the average daily census is the total number of inpatient service days, which remember we just talked about, the total number of inpatient service days for whatever time period you're looking at. So if you're calculating something in a facility, you're going to know what the time period is that you're calculating for. If you're working out a problem on a test, you'll be told, okay, look at the inpatient service days for this day or this series of days or this month. Then that's divided by the total number of days in the same period. So if you were looking at total number of inpatient days for the 3 days on the previous screen that came up to 615, then you would divide that by the total number of days, so by 3 days, to get the average daily census. Okay, I know that is probably completely overwhelming. I had to really study this and look over it quite a bit and then do some hands-on work with this to understand it. So the next tutorial I'm going to work through the first problem on the Check Your Understanding that's found on page 549. It's the Check Your Understanding 10.4. So stay with me, don't give up, and watch the next tutorial so that we can work through each of these different calculations.